Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this tutorial we're going to continue our discussion on form and focus on the particle section of the interface. Now, with all this discussion about the organic shapes that we can create through fractal fields and disperse and twist, spherical fields and all that kind of stuff, you might wonder, why would we ever want to start to change particle types? You would think that mainly we would be using spheres, and that's pretty much it. However, if we take a look at the interface here, we'll notice that we have a bunch of different options. And in fact, if you've used Trapcode Particular, you'll notice that we have the same options. Now, we could use a glow sphere, and that adds a nice little glow to things, and we could perhaps change this to a star and make stars. We could also use cloudlets to, well, make something that might remotely look a little bit like clouds. If we squeeze things together, go to the particle section, and make these really big, and make them soft and cloudy and all that kind of stuff. But what I like to focus on in this lesson is not just playing with individual particle types, but really jumping down to the custom particles down here. These bottom 6 options, sprite all the way through the textured polygon fill, allow us to use other layers in our composition as particles. Now, why is that significant? Well, because it allows us to do some very interesting things with regard to background design like this, where we can pull in either, simple rectangular shapes or custom drawn shapes. But thinking well beyond that, we can get into stuff like this, where we use form to create crowds by taking one small clip and replicating it over and over, because that's really what form is doing, is taking an image and replicating that image over and over in some sort of array. So we'll talk about this as well as background design in this lesson about particles. So first, let's just start with a basic background that we could create with a custom particle. So I'll make my form background here. I'll apply Trapcode Form from my recent effects up there. And let's do some basic settings here. I'm going to create a basic grid of particles that matches my composition. So the size will be 1280 by 720. Now my particles in X and Y are going to change depending on the shape of the particle that I'm going to use. So in this case, let's focus on this design right here. The particle is a rectangle. Now in our particle types here, we don't have any sort of rectangle available, so we'll have to create one. Now I can do this by going to Layer, New, Solid, and I'll make this maybe 100 pixels tall by 20 pixels wide. I also made this 50% gray, so if you go in here, click on your B for brightness, and just set it to 50%. So I can turn that off. In fact, I should probably call this particle to keep myself organized. Turn the visibility off, go to Form, and go to my particle type and select Sprite. A sprite is a two-dimensional image that always faces the camera. We define the texture of that sprite by going to the texture section, which you might have to twirl open, and selecting your layer that we're going to be using. So I'm going to use layer number 1, which is that solid. Now I'll bring the size up to maybe 10, and this is where I was saying we're going to have to come back and adjust our particles in X and Y. So maybe X is good. Let's bring particles in Y down. Now if I go to the particle section and try to change the color, you'll notice that the color is grayed out. This first option of sprite doesn't allow us to colorize it in any way. It just takes the image as is and loads it as the particle. So if you'd like to be able to colorize this, we'll have to select Sprite Colorize, and then I can go into the color here and select a different color for the particle. Now that would color all of the particles, and that isn't very interesting. So to make some sort of color map for those, I'll go to the Quick Maps, go to the Color Map. Let's drag this out a little bit. And I'll grab these colors here and pull these away to get rid of them, and I'll use a basic 2-color map. So maybe I'll use something that goes kind of orange to red. Now this is a one-dimensional map, and I need to pick one dimension of the 3 dimensions in form to map it to. So if I select X, it's going to map orange to red here. If I select Y, it'll take this map and map it top to bottom. I could also select radial, and it'll go from the center outward. And actually, you probably can't see that too well. Let me pick a brighter color just so you can see that. There we go. So let's have these do something. So let's go to our fractal field and have the fractal effect opacity. Now, earlier on in a previous lesson, I was talking about the fractal field and how you can kind of think of it as a luminance map, where the dark areas are lower values and the bright areas are higher values. And the controls that we have available are laid out just like we are adjusting a luminance map. So I can adjust midpoints of that luminance. So I can push this gamma up so that the gray areas are brighter. I could also raise the minimum value here. So those dark areas will come up from black, and I can actually push them closer to 0, so we never actually have those 0 values of the fractal field. I can also take away or add to the fractal field using add and subtract. I think this is probably good for what we need. I'm going to take this flow X and turn this up so that these are going to flow along the surface from left to right. And that's basically how I set this one background up. That's a part of the looping backgrounds from the Guru presets. I have this little background right here that's basically a radial gradient. So if I pop this in here, I'll just copy and paste it. And perhaps set this to screen. So the form is going to screen over the composition here that is a ramp with a radial ramp using red to black. Those points are right there. So there's my red point and there's my black point. That's in a composition. And I put that in a composition so I can use this over and over and have a consistent background. It also makes it easier to change. So if you have 50 different backgrounds that use this one pre-comp, and if you'd like to make one change that it kind of affects them all, I could go inside here and make this perhaps a little bit more purple. And then this would affect all of my backgrounds. Now let's do something a little more interesting, like this, that uses some custom shapes. Let me set this back to my red. Now this was a custom shape, but basically it was just a solid. Let's get into something that gets a little bit more complex and dives deeper into the idea of custom particles. So I'm going to open up this composition right here. And this is a mask that I drew in Illustrator. That's kind of rounded on the corners and has kind of a 90-degree angle on one side. And what I've done is rotate this. So it's at frame 0, it's at 0 degrees. Frame 2, it's at 90 degrees. And then to 180 and 270. So we just have 4 different angles of this shape. And the composition itself is 4 frames long. So I'd like to use this in my composition right here that I've been working with. So I'm just going to right click in this area and say reveal composition and project. And then let's drop this in here. So instead of using this solid particle, I'm going to use this composition. And there's multiple frames in there to work with. So we'll have to tell it how to look at that particle over time. So let's go back to particle section here, go to texture, layer, shape 1. Now we don't see anything because the default time sampling of the particle when we select a sprite is set to sample the current time. So it's sampling the current time of that particle. That composition is only 4 seconds long, or 4 frames long. That composition is only 4 frames long, so we're not going to see anything unless we park ourselves right inside one of those 4 frames. That's not going to do us a whole lot of good. So let's change that time sampling to something else. I'm going to set this to random still frame. So it's going to look through all 4 of those frames, pick one frame, and randomly assign it to each of the particles. You can see we need to be a little bit bigger with our size, but perhaps fewer particles in X. There we go. Now, one of the really cool things you can do in Trapcode Form when you're working with custom particles is to do crowd replication. Being that Trapcode Form is simply a 3D particle array, we can replace those particles with whatever we want, and that includes crowd footage. And we can have this replicated crowd respond to camera movement, motion blur, depth of field, and even After Effects lighting. And in addition, understanding the time sampling options in Trapcode Form will really help you set up a realistic crowd and give you options when you're setting it up. Now, what I mean by that is that when you select that custom particle, either a sprite or textured polygon, we have our texture section and we have a number of time sampling options. Now, you've seen current time, which samples the current playback time, and you've also seen random still frame, which jumps around on the source and picks a random point to assign to the particle. When you're doing crowd replication, you're going to want to use either random loop or split clip loop, and both of these will be helpful to you. Random loop is simply going to look inside your source, pick a random point in time as the starting point, and loop over and over. So in the case of a particle that looks like this, where I have a crowd that is looping, I can assign that crowd particle to form. Set it to random loop, and each of the particles here are going to look at that clip and assign a random point and play it over and over. Now, the other option, split clip loop, is going to allow me to assign different particle types and randomly distribute them to our particles. And let me show you what I mean by that. Inside this composition here, I have 3 different layers. I have this larger crowd shot, I have an individual, looks like they're overlapping just a little bit. So I have the crowd, the one guy, and the 2 people. Actually, let me move you over there. Notice that these are all 5 seconds in length. So this goes to 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. In my crowd scene over here, I can simply select crowd particle split. It's going to say that it's a little big, that's fine. And we can choose the number of clips. So it's going to take that composition and divide it by this number right here and split them evenly. So now what I'm going to see in this crowd are not just that one crowd shot over and over, but I'm going to see the single shot and the 2 shot kind of randomly mixed in. So setting this up is actually pretty easy. You're going to want your form layer, and we're going to want a grid of particles. I'll set this to 1 particle in Z. We'll rotate this. Create a camera so that we can hover above the crowd a little bit. I'm going to make this crowd a lot bigger in X and in Y, and probably a lot fewer particles in X and Y. We want to randomly distribute this a little bit. Now we're not going to reach for disperse because that's going to displace it in X, Y, and Z. I'm going to reach for the fractal field and set this to XYZ individual, so I can have the fractal field push these in X and in Z. This will kind of move them around in X, and this will move them in that back and forth axis here. Also, don't forget to set your flow evolution to 0, otherwise these will be moving around. Now from here, we just need to replace the particles with our crowd. So I'll drop both of these pre-comps in that I made, turn them off, go to Form, Particle, Particle Type, Sprite, Texture, Layer. We'll start with the particle random. It's going to say, yeah, it's a little big. Let's turn up the size. Now by default, Form does use that add blending mode. So let's go in here and set that to normal. And it's sampling the current time. So if I move to 6 seconds, everything's going to disappear. So let's set this to random loop. There we go. We can also turn on depth of field. And maybe you want just a little bit of size random in there. Now to use that other option, the split, so I've got 3 clips that are equal in length, and it is absolutely critical that they be even in length because it's going to divide this comp equally. Let's go back to that layer. We'll select that split layer. Go to split clip loop, set the number of clips to 3. Now we've got a very different crowd. Now in this scene right here, you can see that it actually looks a lot darker and there is a heavy edge on the crowd. Now there's a number of ways to set this up. Now one easy way to do this is to use key correct, which is part of the keying suite, and simply add light wrap. I'm going to use the image itself to light wrap on top of itself. Now, before I do that, or before the light wrap in the chain, I'm also going to add exposure. Let's move this up. Turn down the exposure so it's quite a bit darker. And then in the light wrap here, we'll select the crowd clip as the background. So that's basically the layer that it uses to produce the light wrap. I'll set this to add and turn up the brightness a little bit. So basically what we want is a very dark crowd clip with a heavy light wrap on it. Now I'd like that light wrap to sort of fade as it goes down towards the bottom here. An easy way to do this is simply to add a black clip on top. Click on Preserve Transparency so it is only visible in the areas where there is an image below it. Drop a mask on here and feather it. The idea is that down here there's not going to be a lot of light where their legs are because that area is a little bit obscured. We want the light wrap really to be focused on the upper portion of the image. Now I mentioned other things that will help sell the realism of this are things like depth of field and motion blur, as well as lighting. And we'll get into that stuff in the next lesson.